Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you, reflecting on these suttas that are particularly alive for me. I've been teaching about them, especially in the last few years, and they are very resonant suttas for me. I'm curious, when you received the Zoom link, did you receive PDF copies of the suttas that we'll be working with? Okay, so a few of you are nodding. Okay, great. Some of you had expressed an interest in getting them in advance. I was not expecting you to read them in advance, but some of you had expressed that interest. So the direction or the movement in this exploration that we'll be doing with these three suttas is to explore a teaching from the Buddha where he basically describes what it's like to be in his mind. It's one of the few descriptions of the Buddha offering a description of his own experience, or how a enlightened being experiences the world, or actually more accurately, doesn't experience, because the framing of that sutta is largely in the negative. So that's the direction we're headed, to explore that teaching. That's a sutta called the Kalakarama Sutta. And I first was introduced to this sutta through a lovely little book called The Magic of the Mind by Jnanananda. And it's a lovely little reviewing of that sutta and a whole bunch of commentary by his own thinking about it. And it was just so interesting and inspiring to me. And I've revisited it over and over again. And I've found that particular teaching, it's fairly dense and a little bit opaque. And so what I found for myself is that a couple of other teachings in the suttas can help us to understand that teaching a little bit more. So the first teaching that can help us with that is called the Honeyball Sutta. Many of you may have heard pieces of that teaching in the past. It's a very common, popular teaching. And that teaching kind of is the opposite side of the coin, because the Kalakarama Sutta, the Buddha describes his own experience, what his experience is like, the mind of freedom. What is that mind like? And the Honeyball Sutta, one of the key aspects of that teaching is describing how we usually relate to experience, how our minds usually get involved in their experience. And the difference between those two is essentially the non-involvement of the processes of craving and clinging and selfing in the mind of a Buddha, and the processes of craving and clinging and selfing in our habitual reactivity, our habitual way of meeting the world. And so there are these two kind of bookending teachings, one that describes how our minds work, and this one that describes how an awakened being's mind works. And then the teaching in the middle that I'd like to point to is a practice teaching, the Bahia Sutta, which many of you have also possibly heard before, which describes a way of exploring experience, a very direct meeting of experience that helps us to begin to see the involvement of those processes that get in the way of freedom. And so we'll kind of go in that arc from the Honeyball Sutta this week primarily, to the Bahia Sutta next week, and the Kalakarama Sutta the third week. And there'll be a little bit of weaving back and forth to point to some of the teachings from the prior weeks. But primarily it'll be one sutta a week. So we're not going to explore these suttas line by line. I would like to explore, mostly focus on some key teachings from each of those suttas rather than trying to do an exhaustive line by line study. That would take quite a bit of time. So I want to kind of focus in on some of the key teachings that I found really useful, not only in terms of understanding how my mind works, but in terms of seeing things in practice. Because I'm very practical. I like to understand how the teachings that are in the suttas help me to understand my mind. So that's some of the emphasis that I'll offer here too. So the Honeyball Sutta, I will share the screen and put this up just for a little while, just at the very beginning here to okay, can you see that? Okay, good. I want to get a few more of you on my screen here. Okay. So this is the beginning of the Honeyball Sutta, and you do have this in your paper. You may want to look at it on the paper. So I'm just going to kind of do a little bit of an overview here, and then highlight a few of the teachings. So in this teaching, the Buddha is wandering for alms, and then goes to sit in a wood for meditation. And this person, Dandapani, comes, and Dandapani, it is, seen in this little exchange. He's kind of an arrogant guy, and he carries this walking stick, and the commentaries say that he didn't need a walking stick. He just liked to carry it, and it was gold plated, and I don't know where they got all this detail, but anyway, it's a little bit of a something of a show piece for him, this stick. And he in asking a question to the Buddha, it says, so here it says, Dandapani, while walking and wandering for exercise, went to the great wood. And when he had entered the great wood, he went to the Bilva sapling where the Buddha, Blessed One, was, and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood at one side, leaning on his stick, and asked the Blessed One, "What does the recluse assert? What does he proclaim?" And this whole way of meeting the Buddha, that he's standing, leaning on his stick and not sitting down, that he calls him the recluse, the whole exchange here shows arrogance and lack of respect. So that's just a little bit of a context here. And so the response of the Buddha here is really pithy and kind of convoluted, hard to understand. So here's the response of the Buddha. I'll highlight that. Friend, I assert and proclaim my teaching in such a way that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world, with its gods, its maras, its brahmas, in this generation with its recluses and Brahmins, its princes and its people, in such a way that perceptions no more underlie that Brahmin who abides detached from sensual pleasure, without perplexity, shorn of worry, free from craving for any kind of being. So that fairly pithy teaching does have some very, it's very deep, actually, and we'll come back to this actually probably at the beginning of next week. But this is what he offered Dandapani, because maybe because he was kind of meeting him in his arrogance. And so Dandapani basically expressed confusion, wagged his tongue, shook his head, raised his eyebrows, and then departed leaning on his stick. So he didn't even bother to ask the Buddha a question. It's like, okay, whatever, kind of walked away. And so later in the evening, the Buddha was talking to his monks and told them that he had met Dandapani and what he had said to him. And the monks are equally confused. they basically ask him, well, what does this mean? That's paragraph 7. What does this mean? And so the Buddha responds to them with this teaching. Bhikkhu, as to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man, if nothing is found there to delight in, welcome, and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendency to lust, of the underlying tendency to aversion, of the underlying tendency to views, of the underlying tendency to doubt, of the underlying tendency to conceit, of the underlying tendency to desire for being, of the underlying tendency to ignorance. This is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. Here, these evil, unwholesome states cease without remainder. So that too is pretty pithy, especially this sentence. As to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man, or beset one, beset a person. That sentence is hard to unpack. What does that even mean? And so the Buddha departs, and the monks are left kind of scratching their heads about that one. And then they ask another teacher, another monk, this is what the Buddha said. Can you elaborate on this? And that teacher said, you should have asked the Buddha when he was here, because he would do a better job of elaborating than I would. But I will elaborate for you in my understanding. And so Maha Kaccana says, I understand the detailed meaning to be as follows. And there's this whole piece here. And we're just going to unpack this piece a little bit, because this is this section from here, paragraph 16, is what really describes our usual way of dealing with the world. It's an alternative, it's kind of an alternative description. There are a number of descriptions in the suttas that describe how our minds get caught by craving and clinging, how our minds are stuck in selfing. And there are teachings on dependent origination, the teaching on selfing, the way selfing arises, the not self-teaching. There are teachings on the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, conditionality. So there's a lot of teachings that describe how craving comes to be. And this is one of them. And it actually interweaves, it brings the teachings on the 6 sense bases, the 5 aggregates, and conditionality together. And there's even a piece of the dependent origination in here. And so I'll read just a little bit of this up through here, and then we'll unpack that piece a little bit, and then we'll come back. So this is Maha Kaccana speaking. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. I'll read that part through, and then we'll walk through it. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. So this is, and then he goes through that, and there's a little bit more, but then he goes through it with respect to the other sense bases, dependent on the ear and sounds. dependent on the tongue and flavors, dependent on the body and tangibles, dependent on the mind and mind objects. Mind consciousness arises. So he goes through this structure of how we typically meet experience with respect to every sense base. Now I can see you more fully, which is nice. So this section, let's go into this a little bit more. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. So this is, we have an I. This is the one of the 6 sense bases. The I is one of the 6 sense bases. And as I said, he goes through this with the ear and sounds, the nose and smells, the tongue and tastes. So dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. So there's the I, and there's light waves. There's objects in the world, and the objects, the light coming into the I, there's that meeting between the object, the light rays from the object and the I. And the I consciousness is the seeing, actually, is the seeing. So the dependent on the I and forms, there is seeing. We could say it that way. And the meeting of these 3 is contact. There's an impingement. There's actually this physical meeting, you know, and there is actually physical impingement. The light, I mean, we know this from science. I don't know that the Buddha knew this, but you know, the photons actually physically impinge on the retina. So there's actual contact, and it's the same with smell, sound, taste, touch. You know, there's that contact. There's dependent on the body and form. So this shirt, for instance, this is an object and it's contacting the body, and there's sensation there, there's contact there. So that's just the simple way that our sense apparatus works. We have our sense apparatus, and we have the objects of the sense apparatus, and there's this meeting, this contact. When there is contact, the next sentence, the meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. So when there's a contact of a sense impression, there is a feeling tone. And this is the teaching on Vedana, of the sense impressions being either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So every sense contact has a feeling tone. It's got one of these 3 flavors to it. It's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Now, some of you may recognize some of this here. The dependent origination, the teaching on dependent origination has a section where the 6 sense bases condition contact, and contact conditions feeling. So this is a piece of the chain of dependent origination. This is a conditioned process that is just quite natural, that when there is an impingement with the sense base, a contact with the sense base, there will be feeling. Sometimes it will be pleasant, sometimes it will be unpleasant, sometimes it will be neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It'll be neutral. So this is just our senses doing their thing. The next thing that happens, and this is said to arise simultaneously with feeling, a perception of what the experience is. So this too is just very normal part of our sense apparatus. We see something, so there's the eye and a form, some object. There's the light rays, there's the meeting, there's the contact, there's a feeling, and there's a recognition. Perception is a recognition of essentially what that experience is. So right now, looking across my room, there's a picture. There's a picture on my wall. So that picture is a perception. We experience what perception is, and I'll do a little bit more on perception in a moment, actually go into a little more detail on perception. But perception is essentially the recognition of what has been seen, heard, felt, sensed. It's the mind kind of going into its memory banks and recognizing, oh, this is what this experience is. So this is a mental process, perception. And so we perceive, we recognize what experience is happening. And then based on perception, here's the next piece of this teaching. I'll read this again. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. So that's what we've covered so far. What one perceives, that one thinks about. Now, this is what our minds do. This is where it kind of veers out of just the normal processes of our senses doing their job into our getting involved. We start to think about things, so for instance, I may be meditating, I may be just sitting, listen, experiencing things, and there's a bird sound that arises. And then the mind starts thinking about that. I mean, without awareness of what's going on, the thinking will probably come in. Oh, what kind of a bird is that? Oh, maybe that's an owl or something like that. So that's kind of rudimentary thinking, just kind of like almost associated with the perception. It's like, yep, that thing that I've heard is an owl. And then the next piece is what one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. Now, often this mental proliferation is understood as kind of taking off in the thoughts. It's like, oh, it's an owl. I wonder what kind of an owl it is. Maybe it's that kind of an owl I saw at Santa Cruz the other day. And oh, I wonder if it's actually, there's one of those here. And there we've gone. We've kind of just launched into mental proliferation. So I want to just stop with that paragraph for a moment and come back and look at perception, because that original teaching that the Buddha gave highlighted this phrase, as to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset one. If nothing is there found there to delight in, welcome and hold to, this is the end of the underlying tendencies to lust, aversion, ignorance. And so 2 words in that teaching of the Buddha are of particular interest: perception and mental proliferation. And so I'm going to take some time to kind of explore those 2 words. So first we'll talk a little bit about perception, then we'll stop and do a little bit of a conversation, take some questions, and then we'll go into the second word for the papancha. Because these are 2 key terms to really understand what the Buddha means, what the Buddha is talking about. So perception is one of the processes of our mind. Perception is understood to be a mental process. It's often explored in the teaching of the 5 aggregates, which is processes of body and mind that make up our experience. This is my understanding of this, of the way this is taught. So there's the body, the process of the body, and then there are 4 mental processes that the Buddha describes. Feeling, the feeling pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, that is understood to be a mental process. perception, this recognizing aspect, mental formations, the host of responses, reactions, thoughts, ideas, beliefs, emotions, whole host of things in mental formations, and then consciousness, that simple knowing of experience. These 5 aggregates are describing basically 5 processes at work. And if we look at the this teaching, this short little teaching has gone through these 5 processes and how they kind of weave together to form our experience. So dependent on the I and forms, that's in the realm of body. I consciousness arises, that knowing aspect. Contact is understood to be a mental formation. There's several mental formations in here. So there's the I informs, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as conditioned, there is feeling. So that aggregate of feeling, and what one feels, one perceives. So that aggregate of perception. So by the time of the perception, all 5 of these aggregates are already at play. So these 5 aggregates are at play in every single moment of our experience. They're like strands of rope, the pieces of a string that are kind of woven together to create experience. So we have all of those together, and then based on the perception, it says we start thinking. That's more mental formation. That's the thinking is mental formation. We think about it, and then we mentally proliferate, more mental formation. So the 5 aggregates are kind of pointed to in this teaching. And then the perception is one of the 5 aggregates that is particularly useful to understand. So perception is understood to be, again, it's a mental process. It's related to recognition, how we recognize experience in the world. So there's the I and the form and the meeting of those. And then so there's sight. There's what sight is pretty much form and color. There's form and color in our world, and our minds recognize those various shapes of form and color and identify them based on history, based on our conditioning, based on prior experience. We recognize what's around us as couch, table, cushion, bell, lamp, picture, wall. We recognize all of that because of conditioning, because of learning. Our minds have learned these shapes are these things. So this perceptual process is a kind of a process of our minds kind of seeing something come in to, like sight coming into our eyes. And the process of perception is a process which kind of goes into our memory and it's kind of going into the filing cabinet. What is the best match? What's the best match for this experience? Oh, couch. Okay, so it comes up with couch. The perception also works not just on this kind of object basis. At one point, we can see this. We can watch this process, actually, the perceptual process at work. On one retreat, my mind was quite quiet, and I could see kind of layers of perception happening. So I, turned and just glanced over at something to my left. And I watched the mind identify the object. Kind of it went in like 3 clicks. First thing it recognized that it was green. The next thing it recognized was that there was jagged edges. And then it recognized that it was a leaf. So the mind kind of it went in that, it was like 3 clicks, green, jagged, leaf. So the perceptual process kind of built on itself. So there's different levels of perception. The more familiar one is the one of objects in the world. We also, this happens not only with sight, it happens with sound. So sound comes in and we recognize what it is. Sometimes we notice that perception makes a mistake. I had an experience of this recently. So there was pretty regularly for the last many months, a new sound outside at night, all night long, a kind of a very repetitive, harsh, kind of repetitive sound that was just over and over again. And there were multiple ones, so I could hear there were different, sounds. And I took my bird identifier out there and it did not identify a bird. And I looked around, what could this be? And I landed on frogs. So not only was my perception, doing this with, what I had experienced, but it was also like using other tools to try to help me perceive what this was. I didn't know what this was, but I landed on tree frogs. I found a tree frog on the computer that kind of sounded like this. It's like, okay, this is some weird new kind of tree frog. Mostly I like tree frogs, they're kind of a pleasant sound, but this was a very unpleasant sound. And it was going on for weeks. And I started having these ideas about tree frogs. And there's a creek nearby. And I kind of had this idea, it's like, I've never heard this sound before. There are tree frogs invading our neighborhood and they're taking over. And that was kind of bothering my mind a little bit. It's like some new creature has come into Mountain View. It's invading. Is this okay? And so I went on for weeks believing this was tree frogs. And then I was in Santa Cruz and I heard the same sound. I was out at a play and I heard the same sound and I turned to my friend and I said, gosh, this is the same sound I hear at home. It's like, I'm pretty sure this is tree frogs. Are the tree frogs, coming in everywhere in California? I've never even heard this sound before. And now I'm hearing it in Santa Cruz too. What's going on? And she said to me, somebody told me that was an owl. And I thought, okay. And then we started seeing owls flying around. And actually, it flew right over the stage and it was quite stunning. And it was pretty clear that the sounds were coming from the owl. So my perception of the sounds shifted. And, so no longer was my neighborhood being taken over by tree frogs. Now there were like cute barn owls in the tree about 50 feet from my window. And I went out one night to see if I could see them and they were there. So, the idea, and I looked at this because the sound was still unpleasant, but it was nowhere near as unpleasant. I could fall asleep to the sound of these without waking up and being disturbed. And as I thought about it, I thought, what is the difference? And it was the belief that there were tree frogs invading the neighborhood that was the problem. That was mental proliferation, the belief, the idea that tree frogs were invading the neighborhood. When the idea was replaced with, there are barn owls, and these are baby barn owls asking for food, because I did all this research then on barn owls, and they cry all night long, waiting for mom and dad to bring food to them. So that sound was baby barn owls. And I actually got to see, the owls in my neighborhood. So this perceptual process makes mistakes. And it makes mistakes a lot. And this is actually a time when we can start to see the impact of perception on our further experience. So this gets into a little bit the proliferation. So for me, the proliferation in that example was tree frogs invading Mountain View, and there was the sound, the unpleasantness, there was the perception, the misperception. It was a perception, but it was a wrong perception, an incorrect perception, that it was tree frogs. And then the mind starts thinking about it and proliferating. And then that idea of tree frogs invading Mountain View then creates the conditions for the sound to be more unpleasant. And when I saw that it was just barn owls, there was not that loop back to like problem with tree frogs in the neighborhood. So the mind was not then adding more ideas and views to the perception of what the experience was. So the perceptual process, we can see the perceptual process. We can watch, especially when we're meditating. You can play with this in meditation, and it's useful to notice perception, because perception, when we don't notice perception, we do tend to leap off of it, as this teaching describes. We tend to leap off of it to thinking and proliferation. But if we see it as perception, if we see it as recognition, then there's the possibility that we can know, okay, this is what's being perceived. Oh, this is my relationship to what's being perceived, and know that it's a construction of the mind. The proliferation, part of the proliferation is around believing what we are thinking. We're believing our thoughts. So we can start to see perception at work. And for me, I'd say hearing is one of the easiest places to do this. So you can play with this, just like in sitting, sometimes you might notice a sound arises. What we often have a relationship with that is like we might go hearing and then come back to our breath or whatever, but we can also notice the process of, we've noticed that hearing has happened. And often it's not just hearing, we notice what we've heard. It might be dog barking, it might be dog, or it might be bird, or it might be leaf blower. There's all kinds of sounds that come in when we're sitting quietly. So that recognize when the mind makes that perception. We can recognize it by, sometimes it will be the perceptual process, sometimes is an experience of saying a word in our mind. So for instance, tree frog was, what my mind was saying when it recognized that sound. It kept saying tree frog. It's a tree frog. It's a tree frog. So, that's the perception part. Or it might, as it hears leaf blower, it might see an image of somebody holding a leaf blower. So the perceptual process might be through, as if we're saying a word to ourselves in our mind, almost like we're labeling the experience. It might be through an image. Sometimes when I am meditating and I hear like a car go by, I'll see an image of a car driving on the street. So there's different ways that we perceive. So just to recognize that, when we can recognize the perceptual process, we have a better chance of not jumping off of that perceptual process into the thinking and mental proliferation. We also, in seeing this, we're seeing the conditionality. We're seeing, perception. Mostly perception just happens. People sometimes, when I point this out and start helping people to explore perception in their meditative experience, people say, well, I'm labeling my experience. I'm saying what's happening. I'm saying bird and leaf blower and car. And sometimes it is a label, but one thing you can check is, are you doing it? Are you actually consciously labeling? Or is it just happening? Much of the time, it's just happening. It's a process of the mind that recognizes experience. It's not self. It's evidence for that not self teaching, to see this process at work. And then when we also can begin to see how perceptions affect our emotions, affect our further reactions. So as I described around the tree frog versus barn owl, the classic example in the suttas, or actually in the commentaries around this, is a snake and a rope, that you might go into a barn or a room that doesn't have good lighting, and there's a rope coiled in the corner. And when you walk in there, you might perceive it as a snake. In a barn, for instance, if you walked into a barn and there's a coiled rope in the corner, you might perceive it as a snake. That may be partly because of context. You're outdoors. This is a place where snakes may be. It's also the shape, the form of a snake. The mind goes to snake partly, and that may be protective. That may be evolutionarily helpful for the mind to recognize a snake when it is a snake, for sure. But the emotional response when we think it's a snake, probably fear, probably a charge in the body. So there's an effect that has. So our perceptions affect our experience. And then we might notice that it's actually a rope, that it's not a snake, and that the emotional response shifts because we recognize that it's not a snake. So this is an important piece also to recognize how perceptions affect our reactivity, our emotions, how do we respond based on perceptions. And this is easiest to see when perception makes a mistake. We can see the difference, like the difference for me between tree frogs and barn owls. Very different emotional response there. So there's a lot that we can see and learn by being curious about perception. So I want to stop there and take some comments, questions, anything you might have to check in about what I've said so far. And you could use your Zoom hand. That would be great because I can't see all of you. Beverly. Oh, you disappeared.
Am I here? Should I put my hand back up?
Yeah, that would be helpful. Then I can.
Here I am. So when you were talking about perception happening automatically, I was kind of like practicing it a bit. And then I realized there were two parts to it. There's a perception that's silence, and then there's the word of what it is. And that follows afterwards a lot longer. Then I realized that I could actually look and have a perception of something, but not actually thinking about the actual word name of what it is. And I thought that was really interesting how, like, I could look at my piano, and without hearing the word piano in my head, there's a feeling of perception of it. And yeah. I thought that was wild.
Yes, there can be that. I mean, sometimes our perceptions do come with words, but they also can come more as a felt sense. We might experience a perception, for instance, I was a dancer for a while, and I could think about dancing, and I could watch somebody do something and feel it, in my body. And then there's also kind of a visual. Sometimes we recognize things from a visual thing without the words. So there's a recognition that, can be quieter than the words. And sometimes I've seen that the words are where it actually starts to go into thinking. It shifts from the perception to the thinking, but sometimes perception is a thought. So it's interesting. Yeah, thanks, Beverly. And Brooke.
Yeah. So I've had experiences of states of consciousness where everything I saw was like shape and color, and that's it. And there was no recognition. It was like I was walking in an alien planet. And I've been just curious about that experience for a long time since then. It was kind of accidental.
Well, I mean, it's not accidental in that the conditions of the meditation created the conditions for you to see the experience in this way. So it wasn't accidental. I've experienced that too. Usually it's when there's more concentration, the mind is less in the world of concepts. And there is perception because there's perception of form and color, but not so it's like that more bare, raw perception than the object. It's like the mind has entered into the space where it's just seeing the bare information, and the recognition part of, like, what the identification or what the concept is not happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like I could see it, and like a stop sign, for example, and I could feel when I started to read the stop sign and think it's a stop sign, I could feel myself coming out of the state.
Yeah.
And so then I would stop doing that and just go back to the form and the color.
Yeah. It's fun to play with if you have that possibility. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Sandra.
Let me see how I put this. So practicing perceptive awareness, I've been dealing a lot with a lot of intrusive thoughts. And what I started doing is, okay, I'm just going to call it a thought. And then I started to realize, oh, that's a oh, that's a story. Like so like the perception of the thought kind of it immediately jumps to the story. It's like I don't have the chance to separate. I mean, it's been helpful to that. Oh, I'm just thinking that this is not happening and all that. But then it's like, wow, look how interesting. It jumps to the story immediately. It's like,
well,
my
and
God.
this is also not self. I mean, this is an example. We can't stop it, but we can begin to and we can't intentionally stop it, as the Brooke's description offers. There are times when the mind won't be going there, but it wasn't something she could do either so much. It was what happened. And it happens when we get curious about these processes. So that's actually some of the teaching next week. What does it mean to just recognize, oh, story making is happening, so it jumps to story. If you can see that it is doing that, then you're seeing something of what the mind is doing. So you're recognizing that thinking process and that story making process. And that's valuable to see. And also that I didn't ask for this. I didn't try to do this. It just happened. That's a teaching. That's wisdom. That's seeing, not self. That's seeing that this is just processes unfolding. The more we can see that this is just processes unfolding, the less we tend to cling to, trying to make things be a certain way, because we see it's just unfolding. It's just happening.
Yeah, I forgot in that part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tanya, and this the last one before we move on to the next part.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to express gratitude for your explanation and your stories, really in the vein of anxiety and hypervigilance. I've been understanding that, kind of like my mind is doing something, but the examples you gave with the rope and the snake and both the bird and the frog, the owl and the frog, it really kind of I don't know, almost provides a mechanism to identify and almost prevent hyperdiligence that creates an exorbitant amount of like anxiety and stress. So thanks, like that's really cool.
Great. I'm glad it's helpful. I mean, just be, I think curiosity is a key, to be curious about what's happening in your mind. And so, thinking about something, thinking again, rethinking again, that kind of process of kind of looping. And that's what we'll get to actually in the next piece, to talk a little bit more about that looping piece. I think you'll really, you'll see another layer of it in the next part of the teaching. Okay, so the next part, go back to that. I'll bring up that sutta again. Okay, so we kind of went through this part. Oops. But one thinks about that, one mentally proliferates. So depending on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there is feeling. What one feels, that one perceives. What one perceives, that one thinks about. What one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. So that's that word papancha. And we'll go into papancha in a moment, but I want to read the next piece, because this is a kind of a loop. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset a man, or beset one, with respect to past, future, and present forms cognizable through the eye. And again, repeated with any of the sense bases. So the one interpretation of the word papancha, I'm going to go through two possible interpretations of the word papancha. One interpretation of the word papancha is proliferation of thought. And that's kind of what was going on with me, with thinking it was tree frogs invading Mountain View, that the mind was proliferating the idea, thinking about those thoughts and getting disturbed by that idea. So this is one interpretation of the word papancha. The word that is translated here is mentally proliferates. The mind running riot, lost in thought. And this is something that happens after perception. Often we can see this in meditation, that we leap from perception to thinking to just, taking off. That's the story. We could call the papancha the story, to use Sandra's language. That it explodes into a whole story. And so it can be interesting to be curious about that movement. We may not be able to stop it. In fact, often we can't, but we can be aware. Wow, look at this. The mind is exploding in story. The mind is exploding in anxiety or frustration. The thoughts tumbling forward often come with emotional tones too. So being a little bit curious about that movement from perception to thinking to story making. The thinking might just be, it's a tree frog, or it's a piano. And then it's, it's my piano, or it's, somebody else's piano, or, what kind of piano is that? So there's the story making, or the proliferation that leaps off of thinking. We can be aware of this. And again, to see it as a process and see it as something that is happening, the seeing of it itself begins to weaken our belief in the whole kind of unfolding of it. So, the seeing of, I have another example. I was meditating, and many of you have heard this one a few times, so you may know this one. I was meditating in Burma, and I was hearing a squealing noise regularly. And that squealing noise was perceived as pig. That was what I was in a village kind of area. There was a village, noise coming over the wall. And I just, thought somebody's got a pig next door. So there was this squealing noise. And hearing this squealing noise over and over again, every night around the same time, I began to think that not only was this a pig, but this was a pig in distress, and that this was a pig in distress because it was being butchered. So my mind created the idea of pigs being butchered on the other side of the wall. So compassion for the pig, distress about the pig dying, all of that was happening. I knew that the idea that it was a pig being butchered was an idea. I could see that as a story. So, I wasn't just, running amok with that. I could know, okay, there's that idea. And what's the effect of that idea? Compassion is the effect of that idea. So feeling that compassion. So I was observing all of that, aware of all of that. It wasn't the mind kind of leaping out and not being aware. So we can be aware of our thoughts and know, yes, this is a story. I don't really know. I don't know. Like I knew that I didn't know that a pig was being butchered. I knew that. And then one night I was walking instead of meditating at that time of night. And I began seeing these bats flying around, and the bats were squealing. The bats were what was making that noise. And so that perception of pig was wrong. And so this was the interesting part. When I saw that, when I saw that it was bats and not pig, the thing that was so highlighted to me there was I knew that the butchering idea was a fabrication, that it was my mind. I did not know whether that was true. I did not know that the idea it was a pig was completely made up in my mind. That was very humbling. And that's kind of how seeing these processes can help us to understand our minds. So that whole experience, actually, the kind of the belief that it's a pig, in that case, that was itself, in my understanding, a form of papancha, because it was a kind of a reification of the perception into a thing. This is what it is. So the idea of papancha being the mind running amok in thoughts, that's one way it happens. That's one interpretation of the word papancha, but it's much subtler than that. My understanding of this word papancha, actually, there's a place in the suttas where the freedom in the mind, the allayment of papancha, is described as being very close to fully liberated. So this allayment of this process of papanchaing is understood to be very close to freedom, to non-clinging, to non-craving, to not selfing. And the freedom is a lot more than just not thinking a lot. We can go into states of not thinking through concentration, and that's not necessarily freedom. That's not necessarily wisdom. So another understanding of this word papancha is the creation in the mind, or the belief, we could say, the believing a perception to be real. That conceptualization, to like that the notion of the pig, the pig's, the squealing sound. The mind thought there was a pig, and it did not question that. It did not even think there was anything to question. It just believed it. So this we could think of alternative definitions for papancha as being this kind of objectification or conceptualization, the believing the concept to be what's actually happening. Now, we can't live without perceptions and concepts. You know, the description of like being in the world with just form and color, that, you know, it can be kind of hard to walk across a room when it's just form and color. So we need our concepts. We need our perceptions, these processes. But what part of the process is problematic? It's a problem when we believe, or when there's a kind of a reification that we believe our perceptions to be what's actually happening. So there's a kind of a reification, a taking the concepts to be the reality. We're not seeing them as processes, as concepts, as constructs of the mind. So this process of objectification, essentially, you know, it's like one way to look at the process of papancha is that it's a process in our minds that basically takes what we are experiencing and creates an objective reality out of it, as opposed to understanding what we are experiencing is made in our minds. So everything we are experiencing, every sight, every sound, every smell, everything in our sphere where we're sitting in this place, what we are experiencing is being created by our minds. We cannot experience actually what's out there. We can only experience what the processes of our mind have created. So we like the sound of the pig squealing, you know, it's like even that sound was a process created in the mind. And then the perception of it as pig was created in the mind. And then the relationships to that, the idea that it's a pig that is being slaughtered, created in the mind. And the whole notion of all the you know, the distress around this pig being slaughtered, all of that created by the mind. I saw that some of it was created by the mind, but not all of it. So this process of objectification, of reification, my understanding is that it like happens simultaneously with the sense of self. So when there's an object, there is a subject. So when there was a pig, there was a me, there was an I knowing the pig. So the process of papancha is very deeply entwined in this process of selfing. This process of self and other. Our minds go through life creating this separation of thing and me knowing a thing. This is part of this process of papancha. And this process of when we are taking our concepts to be reality, that's where then our further interaction with reality, with our further interaction with sight, sound, smells, taste, touch, are influenced by those prior views, beliefs, ideas, perceptions. So the example of the pig is exactly this kind of that loop that the sutta was pointing to. I'll read that piece again. Dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises, or the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. So squealing, ear consciousness. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there's feeling. It was unpleasant. What one feels, that what one perceives, it's perceived as a pig. What one perceives, that one thinks about. It's a pig, and maybe it's being slaughtered and mentally proliferates, believing that it's being slaughtered. With what one has mentally proliferated as the source, so with that belief, this is a pig being slaughtered, perceptions and notions born of proliferation beset one with respect to past, future, and present forms cognizable through the eye. So the next time I hear that sound, that feeling or that belief that it's a pig being slaughtered gets applied to that sound more immediately, more immediately, more immediately, so that the response happens more quickly. It's a short version of this teaching, a pithy version of this teaching. The Buddha said, whatever one frequently ponders, that becomes the inclination of the mind. This is this kind of a looping, that when we have proliferated about something, believed something, so this is, I think this also points to how our minds use belief. That when we believe something, those beliefs then become the filter through which we see the next thing, the next experience. These filters can be lots of different flavors. So, it's like maybe there's a filter of aversion, for instance. It's like something has happened that there's an aversive filter in the mind. I've experienced this a lot, that when I have an aversive filter in the mind and I turn around and see something, there's immediate reaction. Like, those things don't belong here. What is that doing here? So there's an aversive reaction. That's this process of we are not just receiving experience as form and color. We are already have ideas, views, and beliefs that are being applied to what we're taking in and altering how we are meeting experience. This is what this teaching points to, is how much involvement there is from our conditioning to how we are meeting the world. One scholar puts it this way. This is a Buddhist scholar, Pali Hawadana. This process of distorted perception, of placing every bare perception into a framework of emotions and beliefs that have come out of our past, our history, our conditioning, robs the freshness out of our experience. But we are not aware of this constant interference of the past. Because of this unawareness, which is our ignorance or our delusion, we see humanity fragmented as me and others, us and them, and in various other stereotypes, skin color, ethnicity, language, ideology included. So this is essentially, this process describes why we're in such a mess in our world. And the Buddha pointed to in his pithy teaching, which we'll come back to this again next week a little bit, in his pithy teaching, as to the source through which perceptions and notions born of mental proliferation beset one, if nothing is found to delight in, welcome, and hold to, this is the end, and I'm going to skip to, this is the end of resorting to rods and weapons, of quarrels, brawls, disputes, recrimination, malicious words, and false speech. Ere these unwholesome states cease without remainder. So the Buddha points to this process of this reification, this objectification, this separation, this division into self and other, and the applying that kind of division to however we are taking in experience as being the source of war. It's being the source of all the ills in our world, essentially. And so it's really worth beginning to understand this process. Now, again, we're not going to be able to turn it off. But what we can do is begin to see, kind of like I did see, I know this is not a pig being slaughtered. I mean, I know that I don't know. I know that this is a story. I don't know whether this is true. So I could see this as something that was going on. And that, perhaps also gave me the space to recognize that the sound that was coming from the bats was the same sound that I thought was a pig. If my mind had fully entered into that belief that this is a pig being slaughtered, I probably would have been going to Sayadaw U Tejaniya saying, you've got to stop this. You've got to make sure there's pigs not being slaughtered next door. This is so disturbing to the yogis. And, I would not even be able to notice that bats were squealing because my mind would be so tied up in that objectification, into that belief. So that's papancha, that word papancha. And we'll circle back to this pithy teaching at the beginning of the next class, but I want to take time now again for more questions because this is a complex teaching. So yeah, questions or comments or reflections again about this, particularly this part. I hope this has made sense. Audrey.
Thank you. I was just going to say I had a similar experience a couple of months ago where I had gone to bed and I heard a sound I thought was a dog crying. And it got really disturbing. I said, oh, and I immediately went into the dog's lost. It's out in the street. It needs to be helped. So I went to get my husband, like, we have to go find this dog. And my husband went out into the backyard and he said, no, I think it's a bird. So I got my bird identification on my phone and it ended up being a great horned owl baby. So I immediately was like, oh, what a relief. Oh, I love those owls. And it was just like, okay, I saw that I had a different perception of what it was, but not to all those other steps that you mentioned. But
now you can see it, looking back on it. You can
yeah.
see that part was that, the belief, right? It was a belief and there was
Yeah.
action taken based on that belief.
I knew it was a dog.
Yeah, it's amazing. This happens all the time. This is not a rare occurrence. So it's humbling. It is so humbling to see this. But the good news is we can see it and we can start to free ourselves from being pulled into, we can recognize, okay, well, maybe it's a dog. Let's go check it out. So we can take action, not to just not do anything, but to also recognize, well, yeah, perception makes a mistake a lot of the time. And and our beliefs and views, our beliefs and views being shaped by our perceptions. It's happening in our world right now. It's just there's so much division happening around different perceptions of reality. Yeah. Thank you. Somebody else had raised their hand. Mike.
Sorry. So you distinguished the lack of papancha from the quiet mind from concentration. But with the notes that I wrote down was something like the lack of papancha is more about seeing mental constructs as mental constructs, not as the truth or reality. Did I get that right?
So that's close. I want to make sure there's just clarify a little bit. So I said that when papancha, the suttas point to the absence of papancha being very much like the mind of freedom.
Right.
And so to me, that says it's more than just not a lot of thinking. There's something much more fundamental. And so a part of papancha, I mean, the example of just that last story of, oh, there's this dog and I've got to go do something and get that. That is a form of papancha, but the kind of deeper level of papancha in there is the belief in, this is a dog, I need to do something about it. It's so the kind of the reification and the believing of that. So the believing our perceptions are what is actually happening, believing that our perceptions are reality.
Okay.
I would say that is papancha. The believing of it. We can have perceptions and recognize, yeah, we can recognize that a believing is happening. We can start to recognize, yeah, I think this, like I did with the pig, it's like this, I'm believing this is a pig being slaughtered. I knew that that was a belief. I didn't know it was truth, but still it was being believed. So I could see, okay, that's being believed. So that was kind of seeing the process of papancha there. You're seeing the believing making. So I often think about looking at this part as looking at what the beliefs are. And is there, because sometimes when beliefs are exposed, it's like, wow, I did not know that I was actually believing that. I just took that to be true. So the difference between knowing that something is a belief and taking it to be true is very different. Even if the belief is still happening, we can know, well, this is a belief. So it kind of opens the door a little bit to knowing that some other possibility may be possible. Did that clarify that?
I think so, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Tanya, can I take Ronnie first since you spoke earlier? Yeah, Ronnie. Nope. Here we go.
I understand up to the objectification, and once the object is identified, I thought I understand why the subject, the self, would come in, but I don't. Can you say a little bit more between when the object happens, how we come to the self?
Well, it happens together. It's like when we believe there's something, it's like when there is an object, there's implicitly a subject knowing that object. And when we believe that that's an object, a separate thing, so like we believe this is a thing that is separate from us. It's got its inherent reality. When we believe that, then there is some part of our minds that believes it can be very quiet, very like behind the scenes, that I am separate from that thing. I am not that pig. I am not that dog. I need to do something about. I need, so they come together when there's a creation of a believing of a thing separate from me. There is a me it is separate from. So it's that kind of separation, that creation of separation.
I think I heard what you said, but how that separation comes about is still kind of a mystery. I mean, maybe that's what the mind does so quickly that
it is a mystery. I mean, it's a very, the book that I mentioned earlier, The Magic of the Mind, that's what he calls the magic of the mind, that it does this. I mean, it's not easy to see it. It's possible, we can see it, but just I think part of it is to just start with a little bit of the understanding, just kind of through hearing, the wisdom teachings unfold in different levels. There's the first the level of hearing teachings and understanding them just in concept, and we massage them a little bit, and at this point it's like, well, I hear it, I don't quite understand it, and so there's a little bit of reflection, thinking about it a little bit. But as you're thinking about it, there may be a little bit of a different way, just because it's in your mind, a different way of relating to experience. maybe at some point you will begin to recognize, oh, when I perceive that that person is there, I also, like when I'm thinking they, them are doing something, there's also a me here that somehow in comparison, in kind of, contrast to them. And you may start to actually see that experience. Oh, I see that there is that separation, that there is that self that happens when the self, sometimes I'll just say when we're othering, if we're thinking about something as other, there is a self there. And so, you don't necessarily have to find the self there, but just kind of be curious. It's like, okay, well, there's othering, there's a them there. Does that mean there's a me here? To kind of just explore it and play with it.
No, I've experienced that, and I just don't quite understand how the self just kind of jumped in and made itself a self.
Oh yeah, well, it's
kind of like
it's not self that the self does that. The sense of self does that. It's a process, and this is essentially what this is describing. This process of papancha, it's describing that we proliferate. We objectify, and there is that sense of self born, and it's very human. It's not just you.
That's good to know.
Yeah, just be curious about it. And yeah, I mean, why it happens, how it happens, just be curious that it happens. Yeah. Tanya, we have a couple minutes if you'd like to.
Oh, I guess papancha, I thought about, it's really interesting concept to think about it in the sense of ability to have cognitive flexibility. So thinking that if you have a career in which you have an investigative position, that your papancha, you kind of need to have that active, but being able to turn that down when you're not working and not have it pervade the moments in, when you want to be you.
And to recognize that investigative mind doesn't have to be believed. It can be, all right, let's let the mind investigate. Maybe this, maybe this, maybe this. So it can be held in a different way. And I would say you're right about turning it down when it's when you don't need it, because I think it can become very much a habit. But there's also a way to relate to it differently, I think. That you like recognize, okay, these are possibilities as opposed to truth. So I think that's a key here.
Thanks a lot. Thinking about things in these components is like a whole other level of, like, I don't know, therapy is the right word to you, but like even being able to break down. So thanks. That's really cool.
Great. I'm glad. So we're at the end at time, but
I'm just going to volunteer. In the chat, I put a PDF connection for the Magic of the Mind.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, because it's a PDF file. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thanks. So we should stop. I'll get to gallery view again. Yeah, so I can see you all. So I hope this has been interesting, useful, and we'll come with some of this. We'll come back to it next week, but we'll also move into the Bihiya Sutta and start looking at how to look at this, how to actually explore it. So thank you all. You're welcome to unmute and say goodbye if you like.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks.